Hey, good morning, real life. It's a beautiful morning, early. Got my coffee brewing here, and it's a wonderful day to worship the Lord and to give Him praise. It's Pastor Tim checking in from the Church of God of Landisville, and we are praying for you guys this morning. And I wanted to introduce you to our worship leader, Brad Rhine, who's going to be delivering the message this morning and next Sunday. You're going to appreciate his passion and his love for Jesus and his humor, especially his humor. You're going to appreciate his humor. So I hope you guys have a great day. We're praying for you guys, and know that I'm still around. I'm behind the scenes meeting with pastors in East Petersburg and working with the council and also serving at TNT Thursday nights. So look forward to catching up with you some Sunday morning here in the near future. And until then, God bless you all. Hey, good morning, real life.
That's what happens when Pastor Tim is doing technology without As Pastor Tim said, my name is Brad. I had no idea what was going to be on that video. He said he was going to do something, and I thought, you know what? Let's just let it be a surprise. Because I've been covering the second service for him while he's been over here, and in the I've been talking some smack about him, so he owed me for that. This morning has really been kind of a rare treat for me because, like Pastor Tim said, I'm the worship leader over at Landisville, and every single other time that I have preached a sermon, before that I led worship, which is great. I love leading worship. I think it's one of the things that God has put me on the planet to do. But it's a nice change every now and then to just kind of sit in the congregation and be a participant instead of on the stage. The big problem was I didn't have my guitar, and I had no idea what to do with my hands. Because I've had a guitar in my hands for every worship song I've heard for like 15 years. But it's good for my soul and for my ego too, because it helps remember that I don't always have to be the one doing that. But didn't Becky and the worship team do a great job this morning? And Becky really knocked it out of the park with her song choices. I'm really big on having the songs tie together with the theme of the message. I always try to match the themes to what Pastor Tim's going to talk about. And I found that over the years, even if I don't know what the sermon's going to be about, somehow I managed to pick the right songs because the Holy Spirit's working in the background the whole time. And everything just kind of hangs together in a really beautiful way. And there were some brave song choices this morning. Now, I will say that Becky's one of the bravest people I know for a lot of reasons. But for this morning's service, she chose two of the most controversial worship songs in modern worship. See, not everybody loves reckless love. A lot of people take issue with the word reckless. I actually led the song at a youth retreat in the spring. The kids chose the song, they asked me to do it. And before the second or third time we sang it over the course of the weekend, I just asked the kids, it was like middle school age, I said, what does reckless mean? And the one girl shot her hand up. She said, careless. I said, really? So God's love is careless? And I just had a sea of middle school eyes staring blankly back at me because they had no idea how to respond to it. And I said, careless and reckless aren't the same thing. Careless means you're not concerned with any part of the process. Reckless means you're not worried about the consequences. And God's love for us is so big and so deep that He was willing to face extraordinary consequences for us. Amen. And if you still think that reckless and careless mean the same thing, I'm going to ask you a question. Would you rather ride with a careless driver or a reckless driver? Because if you have a choice, they're not the same thing. And the other big one she did was that last one, So Will I. First time I heard that song, I didn't care for it a whole lot, but it's become one of my favorite songs of all time. Because it squeezes so much theology and so much of God's story into one song. It's like 9 minutes long, but it's still a really good song, and it's still a short space for all that story it's telling. But a lot of people think there's a bad word in the song. Did you catch the bad word? The E word. Evolving. I'm not taking a position with this slide. I thought it was just funny. But people lost their minds over that. But evolving just means changing. It doesn't, you don't have to think of Charles Darwin high-fiving the devil when you hear the word evolving. It just means we're changing, and we should always be changing. It says in the song, evolving in pursuit of what you said. We should all be doing that all the time. If we're not changing constantly to become more and more like Jesus, we're doing something wrong. Well, that's 2 controversies so far this morning, reckless love and so will I. I'm going to share a third one with you. On Thursday night, I came over here to listen to the worship team while they were rehearsing. My wife has been helping with TNT along with Pastor Tim, so we just kind of turned it into a family thing. And Becky shared something about Les Miserables being one of her favorite musicals of all time. And I need to confess something to you all this morning. And it's about Les Miserables. See, in high school, I was a theater nerd. And every year, the theater kids, we got to take a bus trip to New York City to see a Broadway show. It's really cool. One year, it was Les Miserables. Has anybody here ever seen Les Mis? Yeah? The movie? Close enough. The movie's more fun if you picture it as Catwoman and Wolverine in those parts. But a few minutes into the first act of Les Miserables on Broadway, I fell asleep. I was out. It did not hold my attention at all. It didn't help that I got up at like 3 in the morning, rode 4 hours on a bus, and I was walking around New York City all day. But I mean, I was just out. And I gotta tell you, when I woke up, it's weird enough waking up in a strange place and don't know where you are. But when you wake up and the first thing you see is the French Revolution, I didn't know what had happened. Yeah, I had my teenage brain had no idea how to process that. But I have put all that behind me, and I've learned to forgive myself, and I've learned to forgive the people that woke me up. But there was one other controversy that came up on Thursday night, and it's probably the most scandalous controversy that we've talked about so far this morning. I want everybody to take a deep breath, brace yourselves, because it's kind of shocking. We got to talking about movies, and Kim confessed on Thursday night. Man, I'm almost afraid to share this, but I feel like the truth has to come out. Kim said she's never seen a superhero movie. So we need to pray for Kim. And we probably need to pray for Brian, too. This morning, we are going to continue the journey that you started with Pastor Tim on the Gospel of Mark. And I trust that he has done a great job bringing you up to speed on chapter 1 and most of chapter 2. I hope so anyway, because I'm going to start at the end of chapter 2. And in today's text, we're going to dig into some more controversy. There's 2 scandalous situations that Jesus puts himself in, all while the Pharisees are just watching and waiting for him to mess up. The first controversy leads Jesus to share 2 truths about a spirit-filled life. And the second controversy leads him to make 2 shocking comparisons. But let's do a quick review of chapter 2 so far. We've seen Jesus involved in 2 controversies already. First, Jesus healed the man who was paralyzed. Remember that? His friends lowered him down through a hole in the roof. Jesus forgave the man's sins, and when the religious leaders got upset about that, Jesus went ahead and healed him physically. Then the religious leaders were calling Jesus out for having the audacity to associate with sinners and lowlifes like tax collectors, which led to one of my favorite Jesus quotes of all time. Healthy people don't need a doctor, sick people do. I've come to call not those who think they are righteous, but those who know they are sinners. I love that verse so much. Because to me, that sums up so much of what Jesus is about. He just puts it so bluntly and so plainly true that you can't even argue with the logic. Healthy people don't need a doctor. It's such a perfect way to explain why we need to be out in the world and not just huddled up in our little bubbles here. But it also paves the way for more controversies to come. So we're going to pick up right after that. Mark wasn't writing this chronologically. This isn't necessarily the order that all these things really happened. It's just the order that Mark wrote them down. But we're going to pick up at verse 18. And once again, the Pharisees are going to use an innocent sounding question, a question that makes them sound pious and sincere and righteous and holy. And they're going to use that to try to trick Jesus into saying or doing something they can act on to stop him. Once, when John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting, some people came to Jesus and asked, "Why don't your disciples fast like John's disciples and the Pharisees do?" Now I love how it says, some people, like we don't know who put them up to it, right? Now fasting is, of course, a spiritual discipline, and it's a good one. It's when you deprive your body of nourishment and you force yourself to rely on God and God alone. And what's interesting in that passage is it's generally accepted that regular fasting, whether it's individually or part of a group, is pretty normal. And that's cool. Because there's nothing wrong with fasting. Jesus himself fasted in the wilderness before he started his ministry. He fasted for 40 days. I would go 40 hours. Fasting wasn't part of the law, though. It wasn't part of what God handed down through Moses, except for one exception that we'll talk about in a minute. But by this time, the discipline of having a regular weekly fast was pretty common practice among the Israelites. But the Pharisees, see, they managed to take a good spiritual discipline, fasting, and they twisted it into something to brag about. In their hands, it went from something righteous to something self-righteous. It went from something that forced you to rely on God to something you could use to brag about, something you could show off to others. See, the Pharisees did what they are really good at doing. They took something simple, a simple spiritual practice, and they corrupted it into an extra biblical rule. And it was like Becky said earlier about rules. The rules were meant to help us relate to each other and to God. And the Pharisees they were so good at that. They could take fasting or tithing or any kind of spiritual discipline. They would completely overdo it. They'd entirely miss the point of it. And then they'd hold everybody else to this super high standard that nobody could meet. And then they would judge them for not meeting the standard. They were fun at parties. So the Pharisees, they turned the spiritual discipline of fasting into a tradition. And we all know what a tradition is, right? It's something you do because you've always done it. They lost the heart and the purpose behind it. And all they could see was it looked like Jesus' disciples didn't care that much about keeping tradition. So to them, that meant that it looked like Jesus didn't care too much about keeping tradition, which kind of turned out to be the case. Jesus answers them starting in verse 19. Jesus replied, "Do wedding guests fast while celebrating with the groom? Of course not. They can't fast while the groom is with them, but someday the groom will be taken away from them, and then they will fast." See, Jesus takes their question about fasting, and he starts talking about mourning with a youth. So a few moments ago I said there was one exception to the fasting thing. That one exception is the Day of Atonement. The Day of Atonement was the one nationwide fast that was called for in the Old Testament. And the point of the Day of Atonement was to remember that all of the sacrifices and all of the offerings that the Israelites presented to God throughout the year. And remember, before Jesus, there was animal sacrifice and all sorts of stuff. All of that was not sufficient to cleanse them from their sin. It was not enough to wash away their guilt. So what could wash away their sin? Nothing but the blood of Jesus. So here, Jesus is basically saying, look, there's a time to mourn, and there's going to be a time to mourn later when I'm taken away. And when you see how much your sins have really cost, when you see what I go through for them. But right now, I'm here, and we're going to celebrate. Because Jesus brings joy, not mourning. And then he drops a bomb on the Pharisees. In verses 21 and 22, he says, "Besides, who would patch old clothing with new cloth? For the new patch would shrink and rip away from the old cloth, leaving an even bigger tear than before. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins. For the wine would burst with the wineskins, and the wine and the skins would both be lost. New wine calls for new wineskins. Now the thing about patching clothes is pretty self-explanatory. Clothes will stretch out. But the wine thing was really interesting. And this passage always kind of confused me. And I don't know a lot about wine. So I did a little research. And you know what wineskins were made out of in those days? Yeah. Well, of what though? Close. Goats. They would take a goat, and I decided not to put a picture of that up on there for you. They would take a goat and they would basically try to keep it all in one piece. Okay, so there'd be nothing for the wine to leak out of. Because goat skin is really stretchy and elastic. So as the wine would ferment, it would expand, right? Like if you shake a can of soda. So the goat skin would stretch out with it. And then, nice and clean, nice and safe. I remember one time when I was about 10 or 12, there was another family visiting with my family for the evening. And we had a whole bunch of snacks and drinks and sodas and stuff sitting around. And we had my second favorite soda, root beer. And at one point in the evening, there was a boy in the family who was about my age. And he decided he needed some more root beer. So he grabbed the 2-liter bottle of root beer. He started shaking it. And he said, "I like my root beer really fizzy." Now, deep down inside, I'm watching this, and I knew it was a bad idea, right? Because we all know what happens when you do that. But I was a chicken, so I didn't say it. But when he finished shaking the bottle, he put it down in the center of the dining room table, and he started to untwist the cap. He didn't get to finish untwisting the cap because the cap shot out of his hands because of the force of all the carbonation. And the root beer, I'm not kidding you. I'm not exaggerating when I say this. The root beer hit the ceiling. It rained root beer in my dining room for just a few moments. Because the bottle, it just could not contain that pressure. And by the way, you never saw a family leave as fast as they did. They were like, "Whoa, we gotta go." They stuck to the floor on the way out. So if you took an old wineskin, okay, a goat that had already been stretched out, and you put new wine into it, do you know what happens? That new wine keeps fermenting, and it expands, and that goat skin is already stretched out as far as it's going to go. So it ruptures. And then it explodes, and now you've lost your wineskin, and you've lost your wine, and both are ruined. So we have goats, and we have wine, and we have clothing patches, but what does all of this mean? See, Jesus was saying that the new life and the old life aren't compatible. To be really clear, this is not about young people versus old people, or hymns versus modern worship music. It's about us. So remember earlier we were talking about the E word, evolving? Like I said earlier, we should be evolving. We should always be changing to be more like Jesus. And as we do that, we become less and less compatible with the things in our old lives. Amen. And if we try to hang on to the old life, we're going to end up wrecking that along with the new one. See, Jesus is telling the Pharisees here that change is coming, and it's sitting right in front of them, and that the old way of following the law is going to have to give way to the new way of following Jesus. So if you keep a track this morning, the first controversy is about fasting. And Jesus uses that controversy to teach two things about a spirit-filled life. First, that he came to bring joy and not mourning. Second, that the new life and the old life just aren't compatible. Let's jump into the second controversy. Verses 23 and 24 say this. One Sabbath day, as Jesus was walking through some grain fields, his disciples began breaking off heads of grain to eat. But the Pharisees said to Jesus, "Look, why are they breaking the law by harvesting grain on the Sabbath?" Now, the Sabbath is often misunderstood, both by us today and by the Pharisees back then. See, the Sabbath, or the day of rest, is one of the first things we see in the Bible. Way back in Genesis chapter 2, verses 2 and 3, we read, "On the seventh day, God had finished his work of creation. So he rested from all of his work. And God blessed the seventh day and declared it holy, because it was the day when he rested from all of his work of creation." Now, I think it's safe to say that if God himself models a certain behavior like that, we should probably follow it. And God writes it into law shortly after that. In Exodus 20, verse 8, we read this commandment: "Remember to observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy." Back in March, my son here had to stay overnight at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia to have his tonsils removed. Remember that? Okay. His room, well, that meant that my wife and I had to stay overnight too. His room was on the 8th floor of the South Tower, which meant I spent a lot of time in the elevator because we were there for like 36 hours, and whenever somebody needs something from the car or from the cafeteria or wherever, that was my job. Not complaining, I got lots of steps in, but I noticed something in the one elevator that I had never noticed before. Some of you might have seen these, but I had never noticed it before. Have you ever seen this Sabbath elevator? I saw that, I took that picture in the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. On the Sabbath, and on major Jewish holidays, it says right on the plaque here, the elevator stops on every floor. Do you know what makes that a Sabbath elevator? For people who practice the Sabbath and refuse to do any work on the Sabbath, you don't have to do the work of pushing buttons. It stops at every floor, so wherever you need to get out, you can just get out. Now, I want you to hear me when I say this. Rest is super important. According to the Bible, if you don't work, you're lazy. But if you don't rest, you're disobedient. But you can take that concept of what it means to rest too far. So you can get carried away with your definition of work. The religious leaders took this command that God gave us to rest, and they just spun it out in all kinds of ways it wasn't intended to do. And that ended up making life more difficult for their followers. They took a rule that was for our benefit. Rest. Rest is a good thing. We need rest. And they turned it into a burden. Don't lift a finger. They had a rule that if you walked more than 1,999 steps, that's traveling, and you can't do that. They did not have Fitbits to track those steps, okay? They had to count them. So that was considered a violation of the Sabbath too. So in the scene that we're looking at, the disciples are probably also guilty of walking more than 1,999 steps. But let's go back and look at the same passage again from Mark 2. One Sabbath day, as Jesus was walking through some grain fields, his disciples began breaking off heads of grain to eat. But the Pharisees said to Jesus, "Look, why are they breaking the law by harvesting grain on the Sabbath?" The disciples were walking through a grain field. They broke off some grain, and they ate it. The Pharisees wanted to know why they were harvesting grain on the Sabbath. I'm going to say that all again. The disciples were walking through a grain field. They broke off some grain, and they ate it. And the Pharisees wanted to know why they were harvesting grain on the Sabbath. Would anybody in this room this morning reasonably call that harvesting? Any farmers here? They were snacking. Whenever I read anything, whether it's the Bible or a novel or a blog post or a news article, I like to insert myself into the story. I do this with movies and TV shows too, and you all probably do it too, you just one bit. But I always imagine myself in the same situations, Like, would I have reacted the same way as some of these particular characters? Which characters in the narrative do I relate to the most? Like, who would I be in this story? And a passage like this reminds me that I would have been a terrible Messiah. Because if my guys had been munching on some grain, and the Pharisees demanded to know why they were harvesting, my response would have been, really? In fact, if I had been in the position of Jesus, most of the red letter quotes in the Bible would just be that. Really? Sometimes I'd shake it up. Seriously? Harvesting. They're having a snack. And then I would call down lightning or brimstone or something, and I would smite them. I would smite them so hard. But see, that's human thinking, and that's why I'm not in that role. Instead, Jesus says something that's kind of even more shocking than that. The next two verses, Jesus said to them, "Haven't you ever read in the scriptures what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He went into the house of God during the days when Abiathar was high priest and broke the law by eating the sacred loaves of bread that only the priests are allowed to eat. He also gave some to his companions." So Jesus brings up this story about King David and how he kind of conned the high priest into letting him eat the sacred bread, which was against the rules. This whole story is in 1 Samuel. We don't have time to dig into the whole thing this morning, but I would encourage you to read it when you have the time. The important part is this. Jesus is publicly making a comparison between himself and King David. Now, King David, kind of a big deal. If you made up a list of all the important Bible names, David would be pretty high up on that list. He'd be up there with Moses, Abraham, Jacob, Elijah, Joseph. He wouldn't be as high on the list as Jesus, but he'd be up there pretty high. And the Pharisees, who held David in very high regard, accused the disciples of harvesting on the Sabbath, and Jesus replied by saying, "Well, it's really not that different from what David did, is it?" Now imagine how the Pharisees would have responded to that. Did he really just compare himself to David? The king of Israel, the man after God's own, this guy, compared himself to David. So here's the best part of this analogy. See, the time period that Jesus is referring to, it was after David had already been anointed by Samuel. Okay, he's gonna be the king. But it was before he was crowned king. Saul was still king at this time. So Jesus is making a very subtle suggestion here that his own time is coming too. So sit tight. And it gets even better. In the next verse, Jesus sets them up. Jesus said to them, "The Sabbath was made to meet the needs of people, and not people to meet the requirements of the Sabbath." He's saying here that the Sabbath, this blessing of rest, is a gift from God because we need it. See, we all need to rest. We need to recharge. We need to be with God. It wasn't designed to be another burden. It was designed to be a blessing. And then Jesus comes in with the finisher in the final verse of Mark chapter 2. So the Son of Man is Lord, even over the Sabbath. Now, comparing himself to David was like a right hook to the Pharisees. This was like nuking them from orbit. Number one, he compares himself with God, which I'm really sure did not sit well with the Pharisees. Number two, he declares that the Sabbath is his day, meaning he gets to decide the best way to honor it and keep it holy. He basically says, I made this day. This is my day, and I'm going to decide what's best. See, Jesus, he didn't shy away from controversy. He leaned into it. He challenged the status quo. He questioned the way we've always done things. And as we wrap up here this morning, I want to challenge you in a few ways. First, lean into the controversy like Jesus. Be uncomfortable. Don't be afraid to question the conventional wisdom. And in fact, if you're not experiencing any controversy in your life, or any opposition of any kind, maybe you're not doing anything that's getting the enemy's attention. So don't try to fly under the radar. Be controversial. Second, remember that Jesus is with us. And that's a reason for joy and not for mourning. Yes, we can and we should mourn over our own sin and over what that sin cost. But here's the thing, those sins are paid for. They're washed away. So there was a cost, but we can celebrate now because that cost is covered. So be joyful. Third, because Jesus is with us, put off your old life. Put off your old self. Leave it behind. Embrace your new life in Jesus and never stop evolving in His image. Your old life and your new life don't mix. They are not compatible and you can't make them fit together. Okay? It's like Legos and Duplos. They're not going to connect. Be changed. Fourth, don't let the rules get in the way of following Jesus. Don't let the letter of the law mess up your relationship with God. Remember that God's word and His commandments were designed by Him to be a blessing to us, not to be a burden. They're not supposed to make life harder. They're supposed to make life better. They're designed to give us life in the fullest. See, the law, the rules, they can't make you holy. They can't make you righteous. All the rules can do is show you how guilty you are. Because none of us can keep all the rules all the time. So take that Sabbath rest. Take that time to just soak in God's presence. And be blessed. Now, all these things we've talked about this morning have something in common. See, the Pharisees let man-made rules and traditions become a burden. They acted like their good works could make them righteous. And they completely and totally had it backwards. Because it's your righteousness that results in good works. And your righteousness only comes from a right relationship with Jesus. Amen. So I'm going to leave you with this morning. Be controversial. Be joyful. Be changed. And be blessed. Will you pray with me this morning?